Walking into Westbrook Defense Industries' executive floor, I savored the delicious irony of the moment. My husband, James, was about to introduce his department's quarterly strategy to the new division director, me, though he didn't know it yet. The same man who had dismissed me as just a trophy wife at his family dinner last month was about to discover that I now commanded the entire military contracts division his team answered to. As he prepared the conference room, his assistant, trailing behind him with presentation materials, I suppressed a smile. The classified military background I'd never fully disclosed to his family was about to change everything. The marble-tiled hallway echoed under my polished military style, boots as I made my way to the executive conference room. In my hand, I carried the portfolio containing James's performance evaluations and my notes for the strategic redirection his department desperately needed, but had been too arrogant to implement. 3 years in Afghanistan as a special operations intelligence officer, followed by 5 years at the Pentagon, had prepared me for this moment far better than he could possibly imagine. Through the glass walls, I could see James adjusting his regimental tie, probably rehearsing the speech he'd give about his team's innovative approach to the new missile defense system. He hadn't changed since that dinner at his parents' lake house when he'd laughed, along with his father, a retired executive from the same company. "Catherine's just my trophy wife," he'd said, wine glass in hand. "She looks great at company functions, but between us, she wouldn't understand the first thing about defense contracting." His father had chuckled while his mother looked uncomfortably at her plate. They didn't know that while James had been climbing the corporate ladder at Westbrook, I had been running classified intelligence operations that directly informed the very contracts his department now managed. Before we continue with what happened next, tell us in the comments where you're watching from. And if this story resonates with you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow's video reveals the shocking aftermath of what happened when I finally exposed my true identity to my husband's entire team. 2 weeks had transformed me from Catherine Winters, the wife James introduced as a former military administrative assistant, his diminutive term for my classified intelligence career, into Colonel Catherine Winters, newly appointed Division Director of Military Contracts at Westbrook Defense Industries. Most employees knew me only by reputation or through formal announcements, a deliberate strategy that had served me well, especially for this moment. The board had recruited me specifically for my Pentagon connections and inside knowledge of military procurement processes, keeping my onboarding confidential until today's official introduction. James's department had been underperforming for months, missing key deliverables and losing ground to competitors. What he didn't know was that I had been consulting anonymously for Westbrook's board for the past year, identifying critical weaknesses in their military contracts division, most of which stemmed from his department's outdated approaches and resistance to innovation. The conference room door opened smoothly under my touch. "Good morning," I said, watching James's eyes sweep over me without true recognition. My military-bearing, tailored executive suit and different hairstyle worked in my favor, along with his own self-absorption. "You must be from HR," he said dismissively. "We're preparing for the new division director. Could you give us about 15 minutes?" "I'm afraid there's been a misunderstanding," I interrupted smoothly, setting my portfolio on the polished table. "I won't be needing 15 minutes. This is my meeting." James's assistant shifted uncomfortably, perhaps sensing something, in my confident posture that James, in his arrogance, missed completely. Around the table, his team members looked up with curiosity. Some had worked with military personnel before. I could see recognition dawning in their eyes, not of me personally, but of the unmistakable bearing that comes from years of command. "Excuse me?" James said, his tone sharpening. "This is a high-security briefing for the incoming Military Contracts Division Director. Unless you have Omega-level clearance, I'm going to have to ask you to leave." The room filled with the soft sounds of papers being arranged as his team members exchanged glances. Colonel Marcus Reed, who had served with me years ago and had been recently hired at Westbrook, sat at the far end of the table. He caught my eye and gave an almost imperceptible nod. He knew exactly who I was and why I was there. His presence was both support and witness to what would unfold. "Let me introduce myself properly," I said, my voice carrying the calm authority honed through years of briefing generals in tense situations. "I'm Colonel Catherine Winters, United States Army, Special Intelligence Operations, retired. And as of Monday, I am the new Division Director of Military Contracts." James froze, marker in hand, halfway through writing strategic initiatives on the whiteboard. The blood drained from his face as the implications sank in. The wife he'd dismissed as decorative, whom he'd never bothered to ask about beyond the vague outline I'd given when we first met, now stood as his direct superior in the corporate hierarchy he valued above everything. "Catherine?" he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "What is this? Some kind of joke?" "Not a joke, James," I replied, taking the seat at the head of the table, his usual position. "Perhaps we should all sit down and begin the briefing. I've reviewed your department's quarterly reports, and we have much to discuss." His expressions cycled rapidly through disbelief, confusion, and the first dawning of humiliation. The whiteboard marker remained frozen in his grasp as his assistant gently cleared her throat, gesturing toward the chairs. "I don't understand," James finally managed, lowering himself into the nearest seat. "You never said. You told me you did administrative work in the military." "I told you I worked in military intelligence," I corrected. "You chose to interpret that as administrative work. I never corrected your assumption, as my work was classified at the time." Colonel Reed spoke up from the end of the table. "Mrs. Winters, Colonel Winters, and I served together on Operation Crimson Shield. Her intelligence analysis saved countless lives, including mine." The room fell silent as the revelation sank in. James's face flushed red, a sign I recognized from our marriage. Embarrassment transitioning to anger, his default response when feeling threatened. His team members shifted uncomfortably in their seats, unsure how to navigate the suddenly charged atmosphere. "Let's focus on business," I said, opening my portfolio. "We have a division to run and contracts to secure. Personal matters can wait until after hours." The morning sun streamed through the floor-to-ceiling windows, illuminating the detailed performance reports I began distributing to each team member. Each document contained my analysis of their individual contributions, opportunities for improvement, and strategic realignment recommendations. I'd spent weeks preparing these assessments, carefully reviewing every project, every decision, every missed opportunity. "As you'll see," I continued, my voice steady and professional, "the MX-7 missile defense project is behind schedule by approximately 3 months. The Pentagon is concerned, and our competitors are gaining ground." James glanced down at his copy, his face paling as he saw my detailed dissection of his leadership decisions that had contributed to the delays. I had highlighted 3 specific instances where his department had ignored recommendations from the engineering team. Recommendations that aligned perfectly with what my former Pentagon colleagues had told me they wanted. "This is," he began, then stopped, visibly struggling to maintain composure. "Accurate and comprehensive," I finished for him, "based on both internal documentation and my direct conversations with General Harrison at the Pentagon last week." The mention of General Harrison, the primary decision-maker for the contract in question, and someone James had been unsuccessfully trying to meet with for months, caused several team members to straighten in their seats, suddenly paying much closer attention. "You met with Harrison?" James asked, disbelief evident in his voice. "We served together in Kabul," I replied simply. "He values my perspective on defense technologies, which brings me to our first order of business, a complete strategic realignment of the MX-7 project." I opened my laptop and projected a new organizational chart onto the wall screen. The structure I proposed maintained most of James's team in their positions, but introduced 2 key changes: a new technical liaison role reporting directly to me, and a demoted position for James himself, from department head to project manager. These changes will take effect immediately, I stated, making eye contact with each person around the table. Ms. Patel will move into the technical liaison role based on her exceptional performance reviews and deep understanding of the Pentagon's procurement priorities. Dia Patel, a brilliant engineer whom James had repeatedly sidelined despite her innovative approaches, looked up in surprise. I had recognized her talent in the project files and the pattern of her recommendations being ignored despite their merit. As for departmental leadership, I continued, my gaze finally settling on James, we'll be implementing a more collaborative approach. James, you'll focus on the project management aspects you excel at, while strategic decisions will route through my office directly. The corporate euphemism wasn't lost on anyone in the room. I had effectively demoted my husband in front of his entire team. His knuckles whitened as he gripped the edge of the table. "Is this because of what I said at my parents' house?" he asked, his voice low and tight. "You're using your position to get back at me?" I met his gaze steadily. "This is because the MX-7 project is 3 months behind schedule, $4.2 million over budget, and in danger of being awarded to Northfield Systems instead. My personal feelings don't factor into strategic business decisions." Colonel Reed nodded approvingly from across the table. He had witnessed my ability to compartmentalize under far more stressful circumstances than this. "Now," I continued, turning to a new slide showing the technical specifications the Pentagon actually wanted, not what James's team had been developing. "Let's discuss how we're going to save this contract, and by extension, everyone's positions in this department." For the next hour, I led the team through a comprehensive review of the project, identifying precisely where they had deviated from the Pentagon's actual needs versus the assumptions James had made. With each point, I could see the team's respect growing, not because I was humiliating their former leader, but because my analysis was sound, my knowledge of military procurement requirements was unmatched, and my strategy offered them a clear path forward. James remained mostly silent, his initial shock giving way to a cold, calculating assessment. I recognized that expression too. He was looking for weaknesses, for ways to undermine me. It was the same expression he wore when we argued at home, always searching for the tactical advantage rather than understanding. The strategic pivot I'm proposing will require intensive work over the next 2 weeks, I explained as the meeting drew to a close. I'll be conducting individual reviews with each of you to ensure alignment and address concerns. I closed my laptop and gathered my materials. "James, I'd like to see you in my office immediately to discuss the transition. Everyone else, thank you for your attention. Ms. Patel, please prepare to brief me on the technical specifications at 2 o'clock. As the team filed out, some casting sympathetic glances at James, while others seemed almost relieved by the new direction, I maintained my professional demeanor. This wasn't about revenge. It was about competence, respect, and finally being seen for my capabilities rather than my appearance or marital status. Colonel Reed paused at the door. "Good to have you back in command, Colonel," he said quietly. "This team needs what you're bringing to the table." When everyone else had gone, James remained seated, staring at the organizational chart still displayed on the screen. "How long have you been planning this?" he asked, his voice eerily calm. "I didn't plan this, James," I replied, gathering my portfolio. "Westbrook recruited me 3 months ago based on my Pentagon connections and expertise. Your department's involvement was coincidental, though admittedly ironic." I gestured toward the door. "Let's continue this in my office." The walk down the corridor was tense and silent. Employees glanced up as we passed, their curious eyes following our progress. News traveled fast in corporate environments, faster still in defense contractors where former military personnel dominated the ranks. I could almost feel the ripple of information spreading throughout the building. My new office, formerly occupied by Charles Westbrook Jr. before his promotion to COO, was spacious and austere. Floor-to-ceiling windows overlooked the company's test facilities, where prototype defense systems underwent rigorous evaluation. I'd deliberately kept most of his furnishings but added subtle touches: a small Afghan rug purchased during my deployment, a framed commendation from General Harrison, and a black and white photograph of my special operations team with faces blurred for security. I closed the door and motioned for James to sit across from my desk. "You've been lying to me for our entire marriage," he began immediately, his voice low and controlled, but with an undercurrent of rage I recognized all too well. "I never lied," I corrected, taking my seat and clasping my hands on the polished mahogany desk. "My work was classified. Even now, there are aspects I can't discuss. You made assumptions about my military career, and I allowed them to stand. At dinner, when my father asked what you did in the service, and I said, when you cut me off before I could answer and said I was just administrative support. Yes, I remember." The memory still stung. Not because being in administrative support would have been shameful, but because he had so casually dismissed my capabilities without ever bothering to learn the truth. James ran a hand through his meticulously styled hair, disrupting its perfect arrangement. "Do you have any idea how this makes me look? To my team? To my family when they find out?" I studied him carefully, noting how his concerns immediately centered on his image rather than the actual situation between us. It was painfully consistent with patterns I'd observed throughout our 5-year marriage. "Your professional reputation will depend on how you handle this transition," I said evenly. "I've given you a role that utilizes your project management strengths while addressing the strategic weaknesses that have been hampering the department." "Strategic weaknesses?" His voice rose slightly. "My department secured the MX-7 contract in the first place. Based largely on relationships I cultivated at the Pentagon," I corrected, sliding a folder across the desk. "This contains the initial A correspondence between General Harrison and Westbrook's CEO. Notice who's mentioned as the key technical advisor they wanted involved." James opened the folder reluctantly, his eyes scanning the document until they reached the relevant paragraph. His jaw tightened as he read, "Contingent upon the involvement of intelligence analyst Catherine Winters, whose work on previous defense initiatives demonstrated exceptional understanding of our operational requirements." "They didn't know we were married," I explained. "When they approached me, I disclosed our relationship immediately as a potential conflict of interest. The board decided the company's need for the contract outweighed concerns about having spouses." In the same reporting line, "How convenient for you," James muttered, closing the folder with more force than necessary. "Not particularly," I replied. "I'd have preferred a different division, but the MX-7 project is vital to national security, and your department was taking it in directions that would have ultimately rendered it ineffective in the field." For the first time, genuine confusion crossed James's face. "What are you talking about?" "We've been following the specifications exactly." I opened my laptop and turned it to face him. "These are thermal imaging captures from the latest field tests your team conducted. Notice the coolant system signature?" I pointed to a bright spot on the display. "It's visible on infrared. Any competent adversary would target that vulnerability immediately." James leaned forward, professional interest momentarily overriding his personal outrage. "That shouldn't be possible. The insulation system is inadequate for the operational environments this system will actually deploy in," I finished. "Your team has been designing for optimal conditions, not for the realities of combat zones." Something shifted in his expression, a reluctant recognition that I might actually know what I was talking about. It was the first genuine moment of professional respect I'd seen from him since we'd met at a corporate fundraiser 5 years ago. "How would you know what?" he began, then stopped himself, the reality of my military background finally sinking. "Harsaw, you've seen these systems in action." "I've seen soldiers die when defense systems failed," I said quietly. That's why I can't allow this project to continue on its current path, regardless of our personal relationship." The weight of that statement hung in the air between us. For a moment, James seemed to see me clearly for perhaps the first time. Not as his trophy wife or as his new boss, but as someone with experiences and knowledge he had never bothered to understand. The intercom on my desk buzzed softly. "Colonel Winters," came my assistant's voice, "the CEO is requesting an update on this morning's transition meeting." "Thank you, Michael. Tell him I'll call in 5 minutes," I responded, then returned my attention to James. "We need to decide how we're going to move forward, professionally and personally." James stared out the window at the testing grounds below, where a prototype missile defense turret was being positioned for evaluation. "Did you know? When you accepted this position, did you know you'd be dismantling my department?" "I knew I'd be restructuring it," I answered honestly. "The personnel files were anonymized when I reviewed them. I didn't know you were the department head until the board briefed me last week. By then, my strategic recommendations had already been approved." He turned back to me, searching my face for any sign of deception. "And you didn't think to recuse yourself once you found out?" "I considered it," I admitted. "But the project timelines didn't allow for another transition. And frankly, James, I'm the best qualified person to salvage the MX-7 project. The board knows it. The Pentagon knows it. And now my team knows it too," he said bitterly. I leaned forward, meeting his gaze directly. "Your team is full of brilliant people whose innovations have been stifled under your leadership. Dia Patel submitted 3 design modifications that would have addressed the thermal signature issue. You rejected all of them without testing." James's eyes widened slightly. "How did you—" "I reviewed every submission, every email, every test. Result from the past 18 months, I said. "The board gave me complete access when they brought me on as a consultant last year." "Last year?" He stood abruptly, pacing to the window. "You've been analyzing my work for a year without telling me?" "I analyzed Westbrook's military contracts division as an anonymous consultant," I clarified. "I didn't know which departments were headed by which personnel. But yes, I identified serious flaws in the MX-7 project development process months ago." James braced his hands against the window frame, his shoulders tense under his expensive suit. When he finally spoke, his voice was barely audible. "At dinner, when I called you my trophy wife, you already knew, didn't you? You already knew you'd be taking over." The question hung in the air between us, highlighting the central irony of our situation. I considered my answer carefully. "No," I said finally. "The offer to become division director came 3 days after that dinner. I almost declined because of what you said." He turned to face me. "Why didn't you?" "Because I've spent my entire career being underestimated, dismissed, and overlooked. First in the military, and then in our marriage. I decided it was finally time to be recognized for my capabilities rather than my appearance." The intercom buzzed again. "Colonel Winters, the CEO, is waiting." I stood, smoothing my suit jacket. "We'll need to continue this discussion later. For now, I need you to brief Ms. Patel on all aspects of the project. She'll be implementing the technical changes necessary to address the vulnerabilities." James remained rooted in place. "And if I refuse?" I met his gaze steadily. "Then you'll be removed from the project entirely. This isn't personal, James. It's about creating a defense system that works, one that will protect real people in real combat situations." Something in my tone must have reached him because he straightened, his expression shifting from defiance to resignation. "Fine," he said tightly. "I'll brief Patel, but this conversation isn't over." "No," I agreed, picking up the secure phone to call the CEO. "It's just beginning." As James left my office, his normally confident stride noticeably stiffened, I realized our marriage had entered uncharted territory. The carefully maintained power dynamic he had established, the successful executive and his beautiful, supportive wife, had been irrevocably shattered. What would emerge from the pieces remained to be seen. The call with CEO Richard Westbrook was brief but productive. Unlike James, he cared only about results, securing the Pentagon contract, fixing the technical flaws, and beating their competitors to market. My military background and Pentagon connections were valuable assets to the company, and he made it clear that my personal relationship with James was irrelevant as long as I delivered. "The board is fully behind your restructuring plan, Colonel," he assured me. "General Harrison called personally to express his confidence in your leadership. Just keep the project on track." After hanging up, I took a moment to center myself, staring out at the testing grounds where engineers in white lab coats scurried around equipment. The irony of my situation wasn't lost on me. For years, I'd listened to James talk about his work at dinner parties, offering insights that he routinely dismissed. Now those same insights would determine whether his project succeeded or failed. A soft knock interrupted my thoughts. Colonel Reed stood in the doorway, his military bearing evident despite the civilian clothes. "Permission to speak freely, Colonel?" he asked, closing the door behind him. I smiled slightly at the familiar protocol. "Always, Marcus." That was one hell of a first morning. He settled into the chair across from me. "The entire building is buzzing. 3 separate people have asked me if it's true that you once saved an entire forward operating base by identifying a pattern in enemy communications that everyone else missed." "Exaggerations," I said, though we both knew the story had merit. "How's the team responding?" "Better than you might expect," Marcus replied, leaning forward. "Patel is ecstatic. She's already pulled the technical specs and is reviewing her previously rejected modifications. The junior engineers are cautiously optimistic. They've been frustrated with the direction for months, but couldn't get past James's assistant." "And the senior staff?" Marcus's expression grew more serious. "Mixed. Williams and Chen are professional. They care about results and recognize your expertise. Donovan is James's golf buddy. He's less enthusiastic." I nodded, having anticipated as much from the personnel files. "And James? Where did he go after leaving my office?" "Conference room C. He's been making calls for the past 20 minutes. Private calls," Marcus added meaningfully. My stomach tightened. James was undoubtedly reaching out to his allies within the company, and possibly to his father, who still maintained connections on the board despite his retirement. I had anticipated this response, but had hoped for more. Time to establish my authority before the counterattack began. "Keep me updated on the team's mood," I instructed, rising from my desk. "I need to meet with Patel and then review the latest test results." Marcus stood. "There's something else you should know. James and Donovan had a closed-door meeting with Northfield Systems' VP of Research last month. It wasn't on any official calendar. This was unexpected information, potentially damaging if James had shared proprietary information with a competitor." "How reliable is your source?" "My niece works in Northfield's administrative department. She mentioned seeing James there when we had dinner last weekend. I didn't think much of it until today." I processed this new information carefully. Industrial espionage was a serious concern in defense contracting, but I needed evidence before making accusations. "Thank you, Marcus. I'll look into it discreetly." After he left, I unlocked my secure terminal and accessed James's company email archives, a privilege of my new position that I hadn't yet utilized. Sure enough, buried in his communications from the previous month was a meeting request with a vague description. External consultation on cooling systems. The timing aligned with a sudden shift in James's technical approach to the MX-7 project, a shift that had actually worsened the thermal signature issues rather than resolving them. A coincidence, perhaps, but in military intelligence, I'd learned that coincidences warranted thorough investigation. I was still reviewing the files when my assistant buzzed again. "Colonel, Ms. Patel is here for your 2 o'clock. Dia Patel entered my office with the eager energy of someone finally being heard after years of silence. In her hands, she clutched a tablet and several rolled blueprint schematics. "Colonel Winters," she began, barely containing her excitement. "I've reviewed the thermal signature issues, and I believe I can implement modifications that would address the vulnerability within the current project timeline." I gestured for her to spread the blueprints across my conference table. "Show me." For the next hour, we dove deep into the technical aspects of the missile defense system. Patel's brilliance was evident in every modification she proposed. The solutions were elegant, cost-effective, and, most importantly, would work in actual combat conditions rather than just in controlled tests. "These should have been implemented months ago," I noted, examining a particularly innovative cooling system design. Patel's enthusiasm dimmed slightly. "I submitted them 3 times. Mr. Winters said they were too experimental and deviated from the original specifications." "The Pentagon doesn't care about adhering to original specifications," I explained. "They care about effectiveness in the field. Your designs actually exceed their expectations." Her face brightened again. "Really? You think they'll approve these changes?" "I know they will," I assured her. "I've already discussed similar modifications with General Harrison. Your approach aligns perfectly with what they want." As we concluded our meeting, I made a decision. "Ms. Patel, I'm putting you in charge of the technical redesign effective immediately. You'll report directly to me, bypassing the normal chain of command temporarily." Her eyes widened. "But Mr. Winters will be informed of the new arrangement," I finished firmly. "This project is too important to let personal dynamics interfere with progress." After Patel left, I spent another hour reviewing test results and preparing for my next confrontation, which I suspected would come sooner rather than later. James wasn't the type to accept defeat graciously, especially not from his wife, as, if summoned by my thoughts, my office door opened without a knock. James stood in the doorway, his expression coldly furious. Behind him, I could see my assistant half risen from his desk, mouthing an apology for the intrusion. "You put Patel in charge of my project?" James demanded, closing the door with controlled force. "I put the most qualified engineer in charge of the technical redesign," I corrected, remaining seated. "The project still falls under department supervision." "My department," he emphasized. "The company's department," I countered, "which currently requires significant restructuring to meet contractual obligations." James planted his hands on my desk, leaning forward. "I just got off the phone with my father. He's still friends with half the board. This little power play of yours won't last the week." I met his gaze steadily, neither intimidated nor surprised. His attempt to leverage family connections was predictable. It had been his solution to every career obstacle since I'd known him. "Your father retired 3 years ago, James. The board composition has changed. But, more importantly, General Harrison has made it clear to Richard Westbrook that my leadership is a condition of the Pentagon's continued interest in the MX-7 project." Uncertainty flickered across his features. "You're bluffing." Without breaking eye contact, I reached for my phone and put it on speaker. "Michael, please connect me with General Harrison at the Pentagon. Use the secure line." James straightened, the first hint of genuine worry crossing his face. "Actually," I continued, returning the phone to its cradle, "let's save that call for when it's necessary. Instead, I'd like to discuss the meeting you and Donovan had with Northfield Systems last month." The blood drained from his face so quickly, I momentarily worried he might faint. "That was a consultant meeting about general cooling technologies. Nothing proprietary was discussed." "Then you won't mind if I include that meeting in my security review report to the Pentagon," I said calmly. "They're particularly interested in any external consultations regarding the MX-7 cooling systems, given the recent similar advancements from Northfield." James sank into the chair across from me, his bluster evaporating. "You wouldn't. I take national security very seriously, James, as should anyone working on defense contracts. I let the implied threat hang between us. Now, shall we discuss how we're going to move forward professionally? Because I assure you, I will be directing this division with or without your cooperation. The silence stretched between us, heavy with the weight of shifting power dynamics. When James finally spoke, his voice had lost its edge of righteous indignation. What exactly do you want from me? It was a complex question, one that extended far beyond our professional relationship. What did I want from the man who had systematically underestimated me, dismissed my capabilities, and presented me to his family and colleagues as nothing more than an attractive accessory? I want your expertise applied appropriately, I answered, focusing on the professional aspect. You're an excellent project manager when you listen to your technical team. The MX7 could benefit from those skills if you're willing to accept the new structure. James stared at me as if seeing me for the first time. And if I can't accept my wife being my boss? I met his gaze steadily. Then you'll need to request a transfer to another division. Westbrook has several non-defense departments that would value your project management experience. The unspoken reality hung between us. Such a transfer would be a significant step down in both prestige and compensation. Defense contracts were Westbrook's most lucrative division by far. And personally? He asked, his voice quieter. What happens to us? It was the question I'd been avoiding since accepting the position. The question that had kept me awake at night as I weighed my career against my marriage. That depends on whether you can see me differently than you did at that dinner, I said. Honestly. I'm not your trophy wife, James. I never was. I'm a decorated military intelligence officer with expertise that this company desperately needs. If you can't respect that, then our personal relationship has more serious problems than our professional one. The intercom buzzed again. Colonel Winters, the technical team is assembled in conference room A for the project review you scheduled. Thank you, Michael. Tell them I'll be there in 5 minutes. I stood, gathering my materials. I need your decision by tomorrow morning. James, either join the restructured team in your new capacity, request a transfer, or submit your resignation. The project is moving forward regardless. As I walked toward the door, James remained seated, staring at the military commendation framed on my wall. I never really knew you, did I? He said quietly. I paused, hand on the doorknob. You never tried to. The technical team was waiting when I arrived at the conference room, their faces a mixture of curiosity and apprehension. Patel had already set up her modified designs on the main display screen. Colonel Reed stood near the back, his presence a silent reminder of my military authority. Good afternoon, I began, setting my portfolio on the table. Today, we begin the complete technical overhaul of the MX7 project. Ms. Patel will lead us through the proposed modifications. As I took my seat and gestured for Patel to begin her presentation, I caught Reed's subtle nod of approval. The transition had been abrupt and personally complicated, but the project was now on the right track. Whatever happened with James, whether he adapted to the new reality or not, I had finally stepped fully into my capabilities, refusing to be diminished or dismissed any longer. The trophy wife was gone. Colonel Winters was here to stay. The technical meeting ran for 3 hours, far longer than scheduled. Patel's innovative solutions sparked productive debates among the engineers, many of whom were speaking freely for the first time. I observed, more than participated, assessing the team dynamics and identifying the natural leaders who emerged without James's overwhelming presence. By the time we concluded, there was a palpable sense of excitement in the room. The MX7 project had been transformed from a troubled government contract to an engineering challenge they believed they could solve. As the team filed out, energized conversations echoing down the hallway, Colonel Reed remained behind. That went better than expected, he observed, helping me gather the scattered technical diagrams. I haven't seen this team this motivated since the project began. Sometimes people just need to be heard, I replied. thinking of how often James had talked over his team in meetings I'd observed during company functions, especially technical experts. My phone buzzed with a message from the CEO. Board meeting tomorrow, 9 a.m. Present your restructuring progress. James's father will be attending. I showed the message to Reed, whose expression hardened. Harold Winters, retired 3 years ago but still pulls strings. He'll try to undermine you. I expected as much, I said, tucking the phone away. James doesn't fight his own battles when he can enlist his father instead. Reed hesitated, then spoke with the directness that had made him a valuable officer in Afghanistan. Catherine, you should know. Harold was instrumental in blocking several women from executive positions during his tenure. He's old-school military-industrial. Complex, views women as secretaries or wives, not leaders. Like father, like son, I murmured, though I knew James's dismissiveness had been learned rather than innate. The few times we'd visited his parents without his father present, he'd been a different person, more thoughtful, less concerned with hierarchy and status. The rest of the afternoon passed in a blur of preparation. I compiled progress reports, documented Patel's technical modifications, and prepared a presentation that even the most technologically unsophisticated board member could understand. By 7 o'clock, the executive floor had emptied except for my office, where the lights still burned brightly. Michael appeared in my doorway, coat draped over his arm. "Colonel, is there anything else you need before I leave?" I glanced up from my laptop. "No, thank you. Go home. Get some rest." "Will you be heading home soon?" he asked, his tone carefully neutral. The question gave me pause. Home. The elegant colonial revival that James and I had purchased in an exclusive suburb 2 years ago. Home, where we maintained the perfect executive family image, hosting dinner parties where James held court while I served drinks in designer dresses. Home, where we had gradually become strangers to each other, our conversations reduced to schedules and social obligations. I'll be staying at the Westbrook suite tonight, I decided. The company maintained a furnished apartment in the building for visiting executives. I have early meetings tomorrow. Michael nodded, understanding what remained unsaid. I'll have breakfast delivered at 6:30. After he left, I returned to my presentation, refining my arguments against the objections I anticipated from Harold Winters. The sound of the office door opening again made me look up, expecting Michael with some forgotten detail. Instead, James stood in the doorway, his tie loosened, his expression unreadable. He held a small paper bag from which emanated the unmistakable aroma of our favorite Vietnamese restaurant. "Thought you might be hungry," he said, placing the bag on the edge of my desk. "You always forget to eat when you're focusing on a project." The gesture caught me off guard, a glimpse of the James I'd fallen in love with years ago, before his ambition and his father's influence had hardened him into someone else. "Thank you," I said, realizing I hadn't eaten since a hurried breakfast, at dawn. "I have the board meeting tomorrow. Your father will be there." James nodded, remaining standing though there was an empty chair nearby. "I know. He called me after speaking with Richard." He hesitated, then added, "He's gathering allies on the board." "To have me removed?" I asked directly. "To have you transferred to another division, away from defense contracts." James ran a hand through his hair, a nervous gesture I recognized from our early days together. "He thinks you're doing this to embarrass me, to get back at me for how I've treated you." I opened the bag, the familiar scent of pho bringing back memories of late nights in our first apartment, when we would talk for hours about our dreams and ambitions. Before I started downplaying my military experience to make him more comfortable. Before he started introducing me as his beautiful wife, rather than as a decorated intelligence officer. "Are you here to warn me or to join his campaign?" I asked, meeting his gaze directly. James flinched slightly at the question. "I don't know," he admitted. "I've been thinking about what you said, about never trying to know you." "You're right. I made assumptions about your military career because they were convenient, because they fit what I wanted, which was a wife who made me look good, who impressed my colleagues and didn't overshadow me. The raw honesty in his voice was something I hadn't heard in years. It was easier than competing with your accomplishments. Marriage isn't a competition, James. In my family, it was, he said quietly. My father dominated every room, every conversation. My mother learned to be decorative and supportive, never challenging. I watched him systematically diminish her until she believed that was all she was meant to be. I thought of James's mother at that fateful dinner, looking uncomfortably at her plate when her son had called his wife a trophy. She had recognized the pattern, but said nothing. Perhaps couldn't say anything after decades of conditioning. So you decided to continue the tradition, I observed. No accusation in my voice, just sad realization. James finally sank into the chair across from me. I didn't see it that way until today. Watching you lead that technical team, seeing how they responded to you, not because you demanded their respect, but because you earned it. He trailed off, staring at his hands. I realized I've become my father. We sat in silence for a moment, the revelation hanging between us. Outside my office windows, the city lights sparkled against the darkening sky, a beautiful backdrop to an ugly truth. The board meeting tomorrow, I finally said. Which side will you be on? James looked up, conflict evident in his expression. I don't know if I can stand against my father. I'm not asking you to publicly oppose him, I clarified. I'm asking if you'll sabotage my presentation or support the technical direction that could save this project and ultimately your career. Is that what this is about? Saving my career after I've belittled yours? This is about creating a defense system that works, I said firmly. One that protects the men and women who will depend on it in combat zones. Everything else, our marriage, your father's influence, my position, is secondary to that mission. Something shifted in James's expression at my words. Recognition, perhaps, of the military officer I had always been beneath the carefully maintained exterior of an executive's wife. You really did this, didn't you? He said softly. In Afghanistan, you made life or death decisions that mattered. Every day, I confirmed. That's what makes the MX-7 project so important to me. I've seen what happens when defense systems fail. I've attended the memorials. James was silent for a long moment, absorbing this new understanding of who his wife really was. Finally, he stood. I won't interfere with your presentation, he said. Beyond that, I need time to think. About the project, about us, about the man I want to be. He walked to the door, then paused. Will you be coming home tonight? No, I answered honestly. I need to focus on tomorrow's meeting. He nodded, accepting this boundary. For what it's worth, Catherine, I'm sorry. Not just for what I said at dinner, but for everything I didn't bother to learn about you. After he left, I sat motionless, the untouched food growing cold. His apology, seemingly sincere, had caught me off guard. I had prepared for anger, for manipulation, for attempts to reassert control. I hadn't prepared for genuine remorse. The question now was whether it would translate into meaningful change or evaporate when faced with his father's disapproval tomorrow. Only time would tell if James could break the generational pattern or if he was destined to repeat it. Either way, I had a mission to complete and a team depending on my leadership. Whatever happened with our marriage, I would not fail them. The Westbrook Executive Suite was designed for function rather than comfort, much like military quarters. I slept restlessly, my mind cycling through potential scenarios for the board meeting. By 5:30, I abandoned any pretense of rest and began my morning routine with the disciplined efficiency ingrained through years of military service. As promised, Michael arrived at 6:30 with breakfast and fresh coffee. He also brought a garment bag containing the suit I kept in my office for emergencies, sleek charcoal gray with subtle pinstriping, professional without being flashy. The boardroom is being prepared, he informed me, setting up the breakfast on the small dining table. Mr. Westbrook Sr. arrived 20 minutes ago and is meeting privately with the chairman. Harold Winter's early arrival confirmed my suspicions. He was setting the stage, priming the board before I could present. Classic military strategy: secure the high ground before engagement. Has James arrived? I asked, pouring coffee into the company's understated porcelain mug. Not yet. However, Ms. Patel came in at 6 and has been preparing technical demonstrations in the adjacent conference room. Michael hesitated, then added, Colonel Reed is with her. He mentioned something about reinforcements. I smiled slightly. The military never abandoned their own in hostile territory. By 8:30, I was reviewing my presentation one final time when Patel knocked on the suite door, her expression a mixture of excitement and anxiety. We've finished the thermal signature modifications on the prototype's cooling system, she announced, tablet in hand. The results are even better than projected, nearly undetectable on standard infrared scanning. She handed me the tablet, which displayed before and after thermal imaging comparisons. The difference was dramatic. The original design blazed bright on infrared like a beacon, while her modified version blended almost seamlessly with the background. This is exceptional work, Dia, I said, using her first name deliberately. How quickly could this be implemented in full production? With proper authorization, we could retrofit all existing prototypes within 2 weeks and adjust the production line for new units immediately after. Her pride was evident and well-deserved. Perfect timing, I noted, returning the tablet. The Pentagon delegation is scheduled to visit in 15 days. As 8:45 approached, we made our way toward the boardroom. The executive floor hummed with unusual activity for so early in the morning. Administrative assistants spoke in hushed tones, executives clustered in small groups that fell silent as we passed. News of the confrontation had spread throughout the building. Colonel Reed met us outside the boardroom, his expression revealing nothing to casual observers, but telling me everything I needed to know. The situation inside was tense. Harold has been busy, he murmured as we approached. 3 board members arrived with him. They've been in closed session for nearly an hour. And James? I asked quietly. Arrived 10 minutes ago. Went straight in. Reed's expression softened slightly. He brought the technical specs for all of Patel's previously rejected modifications. Complete documentation. The information surprised me. Was James providing ammunition to his father, or evidence supporting my position? There was no time to speculate as the boardroom door opened and Richard Westbrook himself appeared. Colonel Winters, he greeted me formally. We're ready for your presentation. The boardroom was a study in old money corporate power. Gleaming mahogany table, leather chairs, oil paintings of previous Westbrook leaders lining the walls. 14 people occupied the room. 10 board members, CEO Richard Westbrook, James, his father Harold, and Charles Westbrook Jr., the COO. Harold Winters sat near the head of the table, his military bearing evident despite his 70 years. The resemblance between father and son was striking. Same strong jawline, same confident posture, same calculating gaze. But where James at least attempted to mask his disapproval, Harold made no such effort. His contempt was palpable as I took my position at the presentation podium. Members of the board, I began, my voice steady and authoritative. Thank you for this opportunity to update you on the MX-7 project restructuring. Before you begin, Colonel, Harold interrupted immediately, I believe we should address the obvious conflict of interest present in this situation. Richard Westbrook frowned slightly. Harold, we agreed to hear the Colonel's presentation first, and I agreed on the condition that we acknowledge the unprecedented nature of this arrangement, Harold countered smoothly. A wife supervising her husband creates complications that this board cannot ignore. The calculated move was designed to undermine my professional standing immediately, reducing me to my marital status before I could demonstrate my expertise. It was a tactic I'd encountered countless times in my military career, though rarely so blatantly. "With respect, Mr. Winters," I replied, my tone remaining professional. "My marriage is irrelevant to my qualifications. I was recruited by this company based on my military experience and Pentagon connections, both of which directly benefit the MX-7 project. Experience which was conveniently undisclosed to your husband's department until after you secured this position," Harold pressed. From the corner of my eye, I saw James shift uncomfortably in his seat. The moment of decision had arrived. Would he support his father's narrative or acknowledge the truth? "My wife's military background was classified," James said finally, his voice quiet but clear. "She didn't disclose details because she couldn't, not because she was being deceptive." A ripple of surprise passed through the room. Harold's expression hardened as he turned to stare at his son. "Be that as it may," Harold continued after a moment, "the timing of Colonel Winters' takeover of her husband's department creates the appearance of personal motivation rather than professional necessity. Perhaps we should allow Colonel Winters to present the facts before drawing conclusions," suggested Diana Chen, one of the newer board members with a background in engineering. "I'm particularly interested in the technical modifications being proposed." Richard Westbrook nodded. "Proceed with your presentation, Colonel." I launched into the carefully prepared overview, detailing the MX-7 project's critical vulnerabilities, timeline slippages, and budget overruns. Using before and after comparisons, I demonstrated how Patel's modifications addressed the thermal signature issues that would have rendered the system dangerously ineffective in actual combat situations. The modifications we've implemented in just the past 24 hours have already yielded significant improvements, I explained, displaying the thermal imaging results from that morning. At this trajectory, we will not only meet the Pentagon's requirements but exceed them, potentially securing additional contracts for related defense systems. Harold leaned forward, his military training evident in his posture. These modifications were rejected previously for valid reasons. They deviate from the original specifications provided by the Pentagon. "With respect, sir," I countered, "the Pentagon specifications outlined performance requirements, not engineering solutions. Ms. Patel's designs meet those requirements more effectively than the original approach." "A claim that can be verified," James interjected, surprising me again. He slid a folder toward the center of the table. "These are the original requirement documents from the Pentagon, alongside the performance metrics from both approaches. The data speaks for itself." Harold's jaw tightened at his son's apparent betrayal. The board members exchanged glances as they reviewed the documentation James had provided. Documentation that unequivocally supported my position. "There's also the matter of the undisclosed meeting with Northfield Systems," Harold pressed on, playing his final card. "A clear breach of protocol that occurred under my son's leadership but has only come to light under his wife's supervision. One might question the timing." The accusation hung in the air, its implication clear. I was using the meeting as leverage against James, exposing his mistake for personal gain. James straightened in his chair, his expression resolute. "The meeting with Northfield was my decision, made without proper authorization. Colonel Winters discovered it through routine security reviews, as would any competent division director. Her handling of the situation has been entirely professional." The admission visibly stunned Harold, whose strategy clearly hadn't accounted for his son accepting responsibility rather than deflecting blame. Richard Westbrook cleared his throat. "Given the documentation provided and the preliminary results of these modifications, I believe the technical direction is sound. Unless there are other specific concerns regarding project execution rather than personnel matters, I recommend we proceed with Colonel Winters' restructuring plan." "I second that recommendation," said Diana Chen immediately. The vote was swift and decisive, 8-2 in favor of continuing with my leadership of the MX7 project. Harold Winters and one longtime ally cast the only dissenting votes. As the meeting adjourned, board members filed out of the room, several pausing to congratulate me on the technical breakthrough. Harold departed without a word, his rigid posture communicating his displeasure more effectively than any verbal tirade could have. James remained seated as the room emptied, staring at the technical documentation he had provided. Documentation that had effectively chosen me over his father. When we were finally alone, he looked up, his expression a complex mixture of emotions I couldn't fully decipher. "Why did you support me?" I asked quietly. "Because you were right," he answered simply. "About the project, about Patel's modifications, about everything." He paused, then added, "My father will never forgive me." "Perhaps not," I acknowledged. "But the men and women who will depend on this defense system would thank you if they knew." For the first time since I'd accepted the position, I saw a glimpse of genuine respect in my husband's eyes. Not for his trophy wife, but for Colonel Winters, military intelligence officer and division director. Whether that respect could bridge the chasm that had opened in our marriage remained to be seen. In the days following the board meeting, Westbrook Industries transformed into a hive of focused activity. The MX7 project team, energized by their new direction and Patel's leadership, worked around the clock implementing modifications. Engineers who had previously kept their heads down now brought forward innovative suggestions, creating a collaborative environment that yielded results far exceeding our initial projections. James surprised everyone by fully embracing his recalibrated role as project manager. He coordinated resources, removed bureaucratic obstacles, and leveraged his considerable organizational skills to keep the technical innovations on schedule. We maintained a strictly professional relationship at work, addressing each other formally as Colonel Winters and Mr. Winters, establishing clear boundaries that the team quickly adapted to. Our personal life, however, remained in limbo. James continued living in our suburban home while I extended my stay in the company suite, neither of us quite ready to address what our future might hold. The unspoken question loomed between us during brief professional interactions. Could a marriage survive such a fundamental shift in power dynamics? 10 days after the board meeting, I received a call from General Harrison that changed everything. "The Pentagon delegation wants to move up their site visit," he informed me without preamble. "They're coming tomorrow, not next week." I sat up, straighter in my office chair. "Any particular reason for the change?" Northfield made some noise about breakthrough developments on their competing system. "The Appropriations Committee is getting antsy." Harrison's voice carried decades of military pragmatism. "We need to show them something impressive, Catherine. Something that justifies continued faith in Westbrook." After ending the call, I immediately summoned a leadership meeting. The team gathered in the main conference room within 15 minutes. James, Patel, Colonel Reed, and the department heads looking expectantly toward me as I entered. "The Pentagon delegation arrives tomorrow morning," I announced without preamble. "We have less than 24 hours to prepare a complete demonstration of the modified MX7 system." Concerned murmurs circulated around the table. Patel spoke. First, her confidence having grown substantially since I'd promoted her. "The cooling system modifications are complete and testing successfully, but we haven't finished the integrated systems check. The target acquisition subsystem still has calibration issues," added Williams, the senior systems engineer. "We'd planned to resolve those by next week." James leaned forward, his project manager instincts kicking in. "What exactly does the Pentagon need to see to maintain confidence in the project?" "A working prototype demonstrating the thermal signature reduction and accurate target acquisition," I replied. "They need to see that we've addressed the critical vulnerabilities while maintaining performance standards." A heavy silence fell over the room as everyone calculated the seemingly impossible timeline. Under normal circumstances, preparing for such a high-stakes demonstration would take at least a week. "We can do it," James said suddenly, surprising everyone. He stood, moving to the whiteboard with the natural authority that had once made him an effective department head. "But we'll need to reorganize our resources immediately. Williams, focus your team exclusively on target acquisition. Patel, your cooling system team needs to support integration efforts rather than further optimization." As he outlined a comprehensive 24-hour action plan, I watched him with newfound appreciation. This was James at his best: decisive, strategic, focused on solutions rather than obstacles. This was the man I'd glimpsed when we first met, before his father's influence and corporate politics had twisted his natural leadership into something more toxic. "Colonel," he said, turning to me after finishing his impromptu plan, "we'll need your authorization to access the testing grounds overnight and your security clearance to modify certain classified protocols." "You'll have everything you need," I assured him, then addressed the entire team. "I know this timeline seems impossible, but I've seen what this team is capable of when working without artificial constraints. I have complete confidence in your abilities." The room dispersed with urgent purpose, engineers immediately making calls and modifying schedules as they left. James lingered behind, waiting until we were alone. "This is exactly the kind of pressure test your father always wanted for the department," I observed, referencing Harold's notorious belief that crisis revealed true capability, though probably not under these circumstances. A ghost of a smile crossed James's face. "He called me yesterday, suggested I request a transfer to the London office to salvage what's left of my career and marriage." The news didn't surprise me. Harold Winters had built his reputation on never accepting defeat. "And what did you tell him?" "That I'm exactly where I need to be." James hesitated, then added, "Both professionally and personally, if you'll still have me." The simple statement caught me off guard, its vulnerability so at odds with the carefully maintained facade he'd presented throughout our marriage. "James, we can't just—" "I know," he interrupted gently. "We can't pretend the last 5 years didn't happen. I can't undo how I've treated you or what I said at that dinner. But I'm asking if there's a path forward, one where I earn back your respect, not as your subordinate or as your husband, but as your partner." The word choice wasn't accidental. Partnership had been conspicuously absent from our relationship. For years, replaced by the performative roles we'd fallen into, the successful executive and his supportive wife. "Let's focus on tomorrow's demonstration," I said, not ready to address the deeper question. "One impossible challenge at a time." He nodded, accepting the boundary. "I'll be at the testing site all night with the integration team. If you need anything, I'll find you," I finished. After he left, I spent the afternoon coordinating with the Pentagon, securing the necessary authorizations, and briefing Richard Westbrook on the situation. By evening, the building had transformed into a round-the-clock operation, with engineers and technicians working in shifts to prepare for tomorrow's crucial demonstration. Around midnight, I made my way to the testing grounds, a sprawling facility, behind the main building where prototype defense systems underwent rigorous evaluation. The night was clear and cold, the testing area illuminated by powerful floodlights that cast long shadows across the concrete testing platforms. Engineers in white lab coats and safety gear moved with focused precision around the MX-7 prototype, a sleek, angular installation that belied its sophisticated capabilities. At the center of the activity stood James, tablet in hand, coordinating between different technical teams with calm efficiency. "Progress report?" I asked, approaching the main testing platform. "We're at approximately 60% completion," he replied professionally. "Patel's cooling system integration is complete and performing beyond specifications. Williams' team is finalizing the target acquisition calibration now." I reviewed the preliminary testing data on his tablet, impressed by how much they'd accomplished in just 12 hours. These thermal signature readings are remarkable. The system is practically invisible on infrared. Patel's design is revolutionary, James acknowledged. I should have recognized that months ago instead of dismissing her proposals. The simple admission that he had been wrong to ignore a female engineer's innovations marked a significant evolution in his thinking. Before I could respond, Williams approached, his expression a mixture of excitement and exhaustion. "Colonel, we've resolved the calibration issues," he reported. "The system is now acquiring test targets with 99.3% accuracy, a 7% improvement over original specifications." "Outstanding work," I commended him. "Get some rest. I need your team sharp for the demonstration tomorrow." As Williams departed, James and I walked the perimeter of the testing area, reviewing the final preparations in companionable silence. The cool night air carried the scent of machine oil and electronics, oddly comforting smells that reminded me of military operations centers during critical missions. "Your team respects you," I observed. "They always did. They just needed you to respect them back." James nodded, acknowledging the truth in my words. I was so focused on proving myself to my father that I stopped seeing the people around me, including you. He paused, looking out over the testing facility. "Especially you." The floodlights cast harsh shadows across his face, accentuating the fatigue lines around his eyes. He hadn't slept in over 30 hours, yet maintained the same focused energy he'd shown at the morning meeting. "You should get some rest before tomorrow," I suggested. "So should you," he countered. "But neither of us will. Some habits from our respective backgrounds die hard." He was right. The military had instilled in me a capacity to function on minimal sleep during critical operations, just as the corporate world had conditioned James to power through high-stakes deadlines. "Catherine," he said after a moment, using my first name for the first time since the board meeting, "whatever happens tomorrow with the Pentagon, and whatever happens with us, I want you to know something." He turned to face me directly. "I'm proud to work under your leadership, not despite who you are, but because of it." The simple statement, free from qualifications or expectations, struck me more powerfully than any elaborate apology could have. It acknowledged not just my professional capability, but my identity beyond the roles I'd played in his life. "Thank you," I said simply, recognizing the courage it had taken for him to say those words. As dawn broke over the testing facility, bathing the MX-7 prototype in golden light, the engineering teams made their final adjustments. The Pentagon delegation would arrive in 3 hours, and with them, the future of the project, and potentially of Westbrook Industries itself. James organized the presentation teams while I prepared my briefing materials. We moved around each other with the synchronized efficiency of people who had once known each other intimately, finding an unexpected harmony in our shared purpose. Whether that harmony could extend beyond this professional challenge remained to be seen. But for the first time since that fateful family dinner, I allowed myself to consider the possibility that my husband might finally be seeing me, truly seeing me, for who I had always been. The Pentagon delegation arrived precisely at 0800 hours, 5 high-ranking officials in crisp military uniforms and 3 civilian contractors from the Appropriations Committee. General Harrison led the group, his weathered face breaking into a rare smile when he spotted me waiting at the facility entrance. "Colonel Winters," he greeted me formally, though the warmth in his eyes spoke of our shared history. "Looking forward to seeing what Westbrook has accomplished under your leadership." I returned his greeting with equal formality. "General Harrison, gentlemen, we appreciate your willingness to adjust your schedule. I believe you'll find the modifications exceed your expectations." As I led them toward the demonstration area, I noted the presence of Richard Westbrook and several board members, including Diana Chen, waiting by the observation platform. Conspicuously absent was Harold Winters, though his absence was hardly surprising given the outcome of the board meeting. The test facility had been transformed overnight, What had been a construction zone of cables, tools, and exhausted engineers was now a pristine demonstration area. The MX-7 prototype gleamed under the morning sun, its angular surfaces concealing the revolutionary modifications within. Technical stations surrounded the main platform, each staffed by specialists prepared to showcase specific subsystems. James stood at the central control console, his posture military straight despite his evident fatigue. When our eyes met briefly, I saw not resentment or wounded pride, but resolute determination. Whatever personal issues remained between us, he was committed to the project's success. "Gentlemen," I began once everyone was assembled, "what you're about to see represents a significant evolution of the MX-7 missile defense system. We've addressed the thermal signature vulnerabilities while simultaneously enhancing target acquisition, capabilities, and reducing power consumption." General Harrison nodded appreciatively. "Ambitious improvements, Colonel, particularly given the accelerated timeline." "Ambitious but achievable," I assured him. "Ms. Patel, our lead engineer, will explain the technical modifications before we proceed with the live demonstration." Dia Patel stepped forward, her initial nervousness giving way to confident expertise as she outlined the cooling system innovations that formed the heart of our modifications. The Pentagon officials listened attentively, occasionally exchanging impressed glances as she detailed performance metrics that exceeded their original specifications. "Most importantly," Patel concluded, "these modifications can be implemented in existing defense systems with minimal retrofitting, providing immediate enhancement to currently deployed units." This practical consideration clearly resonated with the military contingent, whose concerns always balanced cutting-edge technology against field implementation realities. Several officers nodded approvingly, making notes on their tablets. "Theory is promising," acknowledged General Harrison, "but we're here to see results. Shall we proceed to the demonstration?" James took his cue, stepping forward. "We've prepared 3 demonstration scenarios reflecting actual combat conditions rather than controlled laboratory settings." His voice carried the practiced authority of someone accustomed to high-stakes presentations, though I detected a new quality within it: the humble confidence of someone serving a purpose larger than personal advancement. "The first scenario demonstrates the system's thermal signature reduction under hostile scanning," he explained, nodding to Williams at the control station. What followed was nothing short of remarkable. On the large display screen surrounding the observation deck, the MX-7 prototype virtually disappeared from infrared detection when activated, its heat signature indistinguishable from the ambient environment. Side-by-side comparisons with the original design, which blazed like a beacon on thermal imaging, drew murmurs of approval from the delegation. "This is considerably better than the specifications required," noted Colonel Jenkins, the Pentagon's lead technical evaluator. "How does it maintain this profile under sustained operation?" Patel stepped forward again. "The system incorporates a regenerative cooling cycle that actually improves performance during extended deployment. We can demonstrate a 72-hour continuous operation profile if you'd like." The second demonstration showcased the enhanced target acquisition capabilities, with the MX-7 successfully identifying and tracking multiple incoming threats simultaneously, including several decoy targets specifically designed to confuse defense systems. The precision and speed of response visibly impressed the delegation, several members exchanging approving nods as the system flawlessly discriminated between genuine threats and diversionary tactics. Throughout the demonstrations, I observed James with newfound appreciation. He navigated technical questions with transparent honesty, acknowledging the system's limitations while highlighting its strengths without exaggeration. When he didn't know an answer, he deferred to the appropriate technical specialist, rather than attempting to maintain the illusion of omniscience that had characterized his previous leadership style. The final demonstration integrated all subsystems. In a simulated combat scenario, the most challenging test possible without actual weapons deployment, the MX-7's performance was flawless, its enhanced capabilities evident in every metric displayed on the monitoring screens. When the systems powered down, a moment of silence fell over the observation deck before General Harrison broke into a rare, genuine smile. "Impressive work, Colonel Winters. Westbrook has exceeded expectations on every front." "This wasn't my achievement alone," I responded, gesturing to the assembled team. "Ms. Patel's innovations form the core of these improvements. Mr. Williams's targeting refinements provide the precision, and Mr. Winters' project management ensured everything integrated seamlessly under impossible time constraints." The acknowledgement of James's contribution wasn't merely diplomatic, it was truthful. Despite our personal complications, his organizational expertise had been instrumental in preparing for this demonstration, and I wouldn't diminish that reality for the sake of personal vindication. General Harrison nodded, understanding the professional, courtesy being extended. "Well, your team has certainly delivered. The Appropriations Committee will need to review the technical specifications in detail, but I believe I speak for the delegation when I say that Westbrook's continued development of the MX-7 platform is assured." Richard Westbrook stepped forward, extending his hand to formalize the arrangement. "Westbrook Industries appreciates the Pentagon's continued confidence, General. We're committed to delivering defense systems that exceed expectations and protect those who protect us." As the delegation moved toward the conference building for detailed technical briefings, Richard lingered behind, catching me before I could follow. "Outstanding work, Colonel. The board will be extremely pleased with this outcome." "Thank you, sir." The team performed exceptionally under pressure. His expression grew more serious. "Harold contacted several board members this morning, pushing for reconsideration of your position. After today's demonstration, those conversations are permanently closed. Your leadership of the division is secure." The news was simultaneously reassuring and troubling. Confirmation that my position was now unassailable, but also that James's father remained determined to undermine me regardless of project outcomes. The personal cost to James of standing against his father's machinations couldn't be underestimated, particularly within the closed ecosystem of defense industry executives. As I turned to join the technical briefings, I spotted James in quiet conversation with General Harrison at the edge of the testing platform. Their body language suggested mutual respect rather than the forced deference James typically showed authority figures. When Harrison clasped his shoulder before departing, a gesture of genuine appreciation I'd seen the general extend only to those who'd earned his true respect, something shifted in my perception of my husband. The remainder of the morning passed in detailed technical discussions, with Patel and her team answering the delegation's penetrating questions about implementation timelines, durability under combat conditions, and integration with existing defense networks. Throughout these exchanges, James remained professionally engaged, but deliberately avoided dominating conversations, allowing technical experts to showcase their knowledge while he facilitated rather than controlled. By early afternoon, the delegation departed with signed preliminary agreements for continued development and accelerated deployment schedules, a resounding vote of confidence in Westbrook's revitalized approach to the MX-7 project. As the last Pentagon vehicles disappeared through the security gates, a spontaneous celebration erupted among the engineering teams. The palpable relief of people who had worked beyond exhaustion to achieve what had seemed impossible 24 hours earlier was infectious, spreading through the facility as test engineers exchanged congratulatory handshakes and technical staff cheered Patel's leadership. I found James standing slightly apart from the celebrations, reviewing performance data on his tablet with the focused attention to detail that characterized his best work. Despite over 36 hours without sleep, his posture remained straight, his movements deliberate. "Your project management was exceptional," I said, joining him at the monitoring station. "The integration timeline you established made this demonstration possible." He looked up, genuine gratitude crossing his exhausted features. "Thank you. But this was Patel's achievement. Her innovations were revolutionary. I just helped remove obstacles. The simple acknowledgement, giving credit where it was genuinely due rather than claiming institutional accomplishment as personal triumph, revealed how much had changed in the weeks since my appointment. General Harrison was impressed, I noted. I saw you speaking with him after the demonstration. A shadow of something I couldn't quite identify crossed James's face. He knew my father in Afghanistan, served under him briefly before the restructuring of Forward Command. He hesitated, then added, he had some interesting perspectives on leadership styles that proved more effective in actual combat versus those that impressed at headquarters. The subtext wasn't difficult to decipher. Harrison had likely shared insights about Harold Winter's command approach, insights that would have contrasted sharply with the carefully cultivated family mythology James had been raised to believe. James, I began carefully, your father's influence at Westbrook is substantial but not unlimited, he finished, setting down his tablet. Richard mentioned his attempts to contact board members this morning. It won't be the last time. The unspoken question hung between us. Where did James stand in this ongoing conflict between his father's expectations and his wife's leadership? Should join the technical debriefing, I said, reluctant to press the issue when we were both operating on minimal sleep and maximum stress. James nodded, but then surprised me by reaching for my hand. The first personal contact we'd shared since. The revelation of my position. Catherine, when you have time, I'd like to talk. Not about work or my father or the project, about us. The simple request carried weighted implications. Was reconciliation possible? Could our marriage survive not just this professional revolution, but the fundamental shift in how we saw each other? I'd like that, I replied softly, allowing myself to acknowledge that despite everything, some part of me still hoped there was something worth salvaging between us. Something beyond the performative marriage we'd settled into, something closer to genuine partnership. As I joined the technical debriefing, where Patel was brilliantly fielding complex questions from the engineering team, I found my thoughts divided between professional triumph and personal uncertainty. The MX-7 project had been saved, my position secured, my expertise validated beyond question. But the more complicated challenge remained unresolved. Could a marriage built on misplaced expectations and fundamental misunderstanding be reconstructed into something authentic? And more importantly, did I want it to be? The days following the Pentagon demonstration blurred into a whirlwind of activity. Press releases announced Westbrook's continued development of the MX-7 system. The company's stock rose 8%, and engineering teams pivoted toward implementation planning with renewed energy. Through it all, I maintained the professional focus that had defined my military career, compartmentalizing personal questions to address the immediate priorities of the division. 3 days after the successful demonstration, I finally cleared enough space in my schedule to return to our suburban home for the first time since taking the division director position. The elegant colonial revival looked exactly as I'd left it. Manicured lawn, tasteful exterior lighting, the careful curation of success that had once seemed so important to maintain. As I pulled into the driveway, memories surfaced of countless corporate dinners hosted in the formal dining room, where I'd played the role expected of me. Charming, supportive, decorative. The contrast between that carefully constructed persona and my current reality couldn't have been more pronounced. James's car wasn't in the garage, which gave me the space I needed to gather clothing and personal items without the complication of conversation. I moved through the house with strange detachment, seeing it now through altered perspective, less as a home than as a stage set where we'd performed expected roles for too many years. In the master bedroom, I methodically packed enough clothes for an extended stay in the corporate apartment, uncertain when or if I would return permanently. As I sorted through my belongings, I realized how much of my wardrobe had been selected for the role of executive wife, rather than reflecting my own preferences or personality. Designer dresses for charity galas, carefully coordinated outfits, for company functions, all chosen to complement James's corporate image rather than express my own identity. The sound of the front door opening interrupted my packing. James called my name, his voice carrying up the staircase with an uncertain note I'd rarely heard from him before. "In the bedroom," I called back, continuing to fold clothes into my suitcase. He appeared in the doorway moments later, looking more casual than I'd seen him in years, jeans and a simple button-down shirt rather than his usual tailored suit. The informality accentuated how rarely I'd seen this version of my husband in recent years, as if his corporate persona had gradually consumed the man I'd initially married. "I saw your car," he said simply. "Wasn't sure if you'd be here." "Just picking up some things," I explained, gesturing to the half-filled suitcase on the bed. "I'm still staying at the corporate apartment for now." He nodded, accepting this boundary without challenge, another departure from our previous patterns. "I've been thinking a lot," he said, leaning against the doorframe rather than entering the room uninvited. "About what you said regarding our marriage, about my father's influence, about who I've become." The quiet self-reflection in his voice was so different from the defensive posturing I'd expected that I paused in my packing, giving him my full attention. "After the demonstration, I had dinner with my mother," he continued, surprising me further. James rarely saw his mother without his father present. Without my father knowing. It was illuminating. "How so?" I asked, sitting on the edge of the bed. She told me things about their marriage that I never knew, about how my father systematically undermined her career in education administration until she finally gave it up to become the corporate wife he wanted. His voice tightened. She recognized what was happening between us years ago but didn't say anything because she thought that's just how marriages worked in our circles. The revelation wasn't entirely surprising. I'd sensed James's mother's discomfort during that fateful dinner when her son had echoed her husband's dismissive attitude. What surprised me was James's willingness to see the pattern and acknowledge its toxicity. "She asked me a question I couldn't answer," he continued, finally entering the room and sitting in the reading chair opposite the bed. "She asked if I was happier now than when we first got married, if all the status and advancement had actually made me more fulfilled." The question hung in the air between us, profound in its simplicity. I remembered the James I'd first met, ambitious but idealistically so, committed to creating defense technologies that genuinely protected soldiers rather than merely advancing corporate interests. Somewhere along his rise through Westbrook, that idealism had been gradually replaced by a focus on status, power, and his father's approval. "And what was your answer?" I asked. "I didn't have one," he admitted. "I've been so focused on climbing the corporate ladder, on proving myself to my father, that I stopped asking whether any of it was making me happy." He looked directly at me. "Or whether it was making you happy." The moment felt pivotal. Perhaps the first time in years that James had acknowledged my happiness as distinct from his success, my fulfillment as separate from my role in his life. "When did you stop seeing me, James?" I asked quietly. "When did I become an accessory rather than a partner?" He considered the question with genuine reflection rather than defensive deflection. "I think it happened gradually, without either of us realizing it. Each promotion came with new expectations about how an executive family should present itself. Each step up the ladder narrowed how I defined success. And success required a certain type of wife," I finished for him. "A trophy wife," he acknowledged, the phrase catching slightly in his throat. God, Catherine, when I said that at dinner, I've never felt more ashamed of anything in my life. Not because it became professionally awkward later, but because I saw your face in that moment. I saw how deeply I hurt you, and I still didn't apologize. The raw honesty in his voice reached past my carefully maintained professional boundaries. This wasn't the calculated contrition of someone trying to salvage his career or reputation. This was genuine remorse from someone finally seeing the consequences of his choices. "The thing is," he continued when I remained silent, "watching you these past weeks, seeing your leadership, your technical knowledge, the respect you've earned from the team, I realize I've been married to an extraordinary woman for 5 years, and somehow convinced myself that your greatest value was how you looked on my arm at company functions." The irony of our situation settled between us. How James had overlooked my capabilities while I had gradually surrendered them, both of us complicit in constructing a marriage built more on appearance than substance. "I don't expect you to forgive me," he said after a moment, "or to come back. I just wanted you to know that I see the damage I've done, to you, to us, to myself. And regardless of what happens between us personally, I'm committed to supporting your leadership professionally. No more divided loyalties." The statement carried particular weight given Harold's continued attempts to undermine my position. James was declaring his independence from his father's influence, something I hadn't been certain he could do. "What about your father?" I asked directly. James's expression hardened slightly. "I told him yesterday that if he continues attempting to interfere with your leadership, I'll publicly support you, even if that means contradicting him in front of the board." He didn't take it well. I could imagine Harold's reaction to such unprecedented rebellion from his son. That must have been difficult. "Less difficult than continuing to be someone I don't respect," James replied simply. "Whether we find a way forward together or not, I need to reclaim some integrity." The quiet dignity in his voice resonated with something I'd glimpsed in our early relationship, before corporate politics and family expectations had reshaped him into his father's image. It reminded me why I'd fallen in love with him initially, seeing potential for genuine partnership that had gradually been buried under performance and pretense. "I don't know what happens next with us," I said honestly. "There's been too much dishonesty on both sides. You presenting me as less than I am, me allowing it to happen rather than challenging it directly. I understand," he said, rising from the chair. "I'm not asking for immediate answers, just the chance to show you who I can be when I'm not trying to be my father." He moved toward the door, then paused. "Whatever you decide about us, Catherine, don't doubt your leadership capability for a moment. You've transformed that division in ways I never could have." After he left, I sat motionless on the edge of the bed, my packing temporarily forgotten. The conversation had unfolded nothing like I'd anticipated. No defensiveness, no attempts to re-establish control, no subtle manipulations to make me question my decisions. Instead, James had shown genuine self-reflection and accountability, qualities I'd begun to think he was incapable of demonstrating. The question now was whether those qualities represented a momentary insight or a fundamental shift, and whether our marriage deserved another chance after years of mutual misrepresentation. I finished packing methodically, the practiced compartmentalization of my military training allowing me to set aside personal questions temporarily. Whatever decisions lay ahead about our relationship, I had a division to lead and a revolutionary defense system to implement. Those professional responsibilities required my immediate focus. As I carried my suitcase downstairs, I noticed something. On the entryway table that hadn't been there when I arrived, a framed photograph I didn't immediately recognize. Moving closer, I realized it was from my military commissioning ceremony, where I stood proudly in dress uniform receiving my officer's insignia. I had no memory of sharing this photo with James. It must have been buried in the personal files I kept in my home office. The fact that he'd found it, framed it, and placed it prominently in our home spoke volumes about his changing perspective. A small but meaningful acknowledgement of the identity I'd submerged during our marriage. Whether that acknowledgement had come too late remained to be seen. 2. Weeks after the Pentagon demonstration, Westbrook Industries hosted a formal ceremony celebrating the MX-7 contract extension. The company's largest conference center had been transformed for the occasion, military flags flanking the stage, distinguished guests from both the defense industry and Pentagon in attendance, champagne flowing freely as executives celebrated. the billion-dollar contract renewal. I stood near the edge of the room, observing the festivities with the slight detachment that had become my natural state. My dress uniform, which I'd chosen over civilian attire, drew respectful nods from the military personnel present while serving as a reminder to everyone else of my background and qualifications. "The woman of the hour avoiding the spotlight," remarked Colonel Reed, appearing at my side with 2 glasses of sparkling water. He handed me one. "Some habits from intelligence work never fade." "Observation before engagement," I agreed, accepting the drink. "How are the engineers handling the attention?" Reed nodded toward a cluster of technical staff where Dia Patel was animatedly explaining something to an attentive General Harrison. "They're finally getting the recognition they deserve." Patel's practically glowing. 3 defense contractors have already tried to poach her this week. "And will they succeed?" I asked, genuinely concerned about losing our most innovative engineer. "Not a chance." She told the last one that she'd finally found a company where her ideas matter more than her gender, said she wouldn't leave for twice the salary. Reed's expression softened with pride. "You've built something important here, Catherine. Something beyond the contract or the technology." Before I could respond, Richard Westbrook tapped a microphone at the front of the room, calling for attention. The crowd quieted as he launched into a predictably self-congratulatory speech about Westbrook Industries' commitment to innovation and national security. While many contributed to this achievement, he concluded, one leader transformed not just the technology but the culture that created it. "Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome Colonel Catherine Winters, our Military Contracts Division Director." The sigh. Applause that greeted me as I made my way to the podium felt surreal. Acknowledging my professional achievement in a room that included many who had previously known me only as James's attractive, quiet wife. I spotted several of his family, friends doing double takes as they finally connected my identity to my position. "Thank you," I began once the applause subsided. "Military intelligence taught me that the most critical factor in any mission isn't technology, though that matters greatly. It isn't resources, though those are essential. It's people, specifically. People empowered to contribute their best ideas regardless of rank or background." I paused, making deliberate eye contact with Patel and her engineering team. The MX-7's revolutionary capabilities emerged when we created an environment where innovation was valued over hierarchy, where technical merit determined decisions rather than position or title. From the corner of my eye, I could see James standing, with the project management team, his expression one of quiet pride rather than resentment. The transformation in his professional demeanor over the past weeks had been remarkable, from territorial department head to collaborative team member, genuinely supporting rather than competing with the technical experts. "This contract represents more than a business achievement," I continued. "It represents a defense system that will genuinely protect our service members in the field. As someone who has seen firsthand the consequences of inadequate protection, I can assure you there is no higher purpose we could serve." The gravity of my statement resonated particularly with the military personnel present, several senior officers, nodding in solemn agreement. Defense contracting too often prioritized profit margins over practical field effectiveness. My reminder of the human lives at stake shifted the tenor of the celebration. I want to specifically acknowledge Ms. Dia Patel, whose cooling system innovations form the heart of the MX-7's capabilities, and Mr. James Winters, whose project management expertise transformed an impossible timeline into achievable milestones. The public acknowledgement of James's contribution wasn't merely diplomatic, it was deserved. Whatever personal complications remained between us, his professional performance had been exemplary once he embraced his recalibrated role. As I concluded my remarks and the formal ceremony transitioned to celebratory mingling, I found myself approached by an elegant older woman I immediately recognized, James's mother, Eleanor Winters. She had attended numerous corporate functions during our marriage, but had always remained carefully in the background, a supporting character in Harold's narrative. "Catherine," she greeted me warmly, clasping my hand in both of hers. "Your speech was magnificent, though not nearly as magnificent as what you've accomplished here." "Thank you, Eleanor. I'm surprised to see you without Harold." Her husband's conspicuous absence from such a significant corporate event spoke volumes about the ongoing family drama. A flicker of something, relief perhaps, crossed her refined features. "Harold has decided to extend his golf trip in Florida, indefinitely. The board's unwavering support for your leadership has been difficult for him to accept." The diplomatic phrasing barely concealed the reality. Harold Winters, accustomed to wielding influence even in retirement, had been definitively outmaneuvered. His self-imposed exile was both tantrum and strategic retreat. "James told me about your dinner," I said carefully, watching her expression. "About the parallels you drew between your marriage and ours." Eleanor's perfectly composed facade cracked, slightly, revealing glimpses of the capable woman who had once led her school district before surrendering her career to Harold's demands. "I should have said something years ago, when I first saw the pattern repeating. Perhaps I could have spared you both some pain, or perhaps we needed to discover it ourselves," I suggested gently. She studied me with unexpected directness. "He's trying, Catherine. Really trying, in ways Harold never did. I've seen more growth in him these past weeks than in the previous 5 years." Before I could formulate a response to this maternal observation, we were interrupted by the arrival of General Harrison, who requested a private word about implementation timelines. Eleanor gracefully excused herself, though not before giving my arm a meaningful squeeze. The remainder of the evening passed in a blur of congratulations and strategic conversations. Throughout it all, I maintained the professional demeanor that had become my armor, engaging substantively while keeping personal matters carefully compartmentalized. It was nearly midnight when the event finally wound down. As the last guests departed, I found myself alone in the conference center's attached terrace, enjoying a moment of quiet under the stars. The cool night air was a welcome relief after hours of climate-controlled formality. "May I join you?" James's voice came from the doorway, neither presumptuous nor hesitant. I nodded, gesturing to the empty space beside me at the stone balustrade. "You were magnificent tonight," he said, maintaining a respectful distance as he gazed out at the city lights. "Not just professional, inspiring. You reminded everyone what this work actually means beyond corporate profits." "It needed to be said," I replied. "Too often we forget the real-world implications of what we're developing here." We stood in surprisingly comfortable silence for several moments before James spoke again. "I've been offered a position at the London office," he said quietly. "Senior project management for their international defense collaborations. Richard presented it as an opportunity, but we both know it's a way to resolve any awkwardness in our reporting structure." The news landed with unexpected weight. Though our personal relationship remained unresolved, we had established a functional professional dynamic that benefited the division. His departure would remove both the complication and the contribution. "Is that what you want?" I asked, turning to study his profile in the dim light. "What I want," he replied carefully, "is whatever gives us the best chance at finding our way back to each other. Not as we were, but as we could be. If that means physical distance while we figure things out, I'll go to London. If it means staying and finding a way to work together while rebuilding trust, I'll stay." The simple deference to my preference, placing our relationship above his career ambitions, represented perhaps the most fundamental shift in James's priorities since I'd known him. "I don't have an answer yet," I admitted. "About us. About what's possible after everything that's happened." "I know," he said gently. "I'm not asking for one tonight. Just letting you know that whatever you decide, I'll respect it. The choice is yours, Catherine. It probably always should have been." As he turned to leave, offering me space rather than pressing for resolution, I found myself speaking almost involuntarily. "James." He paused, looking back expectantly. I'm having dinner at the Riverside Cafe tomorrow night, 7 o'clock. The neutral location, neither our home nor a corporate venue, offered a context for conversation without pressure or pretense. A hopeful smile touched his features, quickly tempered, with understanding of the tentative nature of the invitation. I'll be there. After he left, I remained on the terrace alone, considering the improbable journey that had brought me to this moment. 3 weeks ago, I had been division director in title only, my husband still reeling from the revelation, our marriage seemingly beyond salvage. Now, with the Pentagon contract secured and James demonstrating genuine change, possibilities existed that I hadn't dared consider. Whether those possibilities could overcome years of accumulated misunderstanding remained to be seen. But for the first time since that fateful family dinner, I was willing to find out. 2 years later, I stood at the podium in the Pentagon's main briefing room, presenting the enhanced MX-7 system's field performance data to a room full of military leaders. The system had been deployed in 3 conflict zones, saving countless lives with its superior detection capabilities. Colonel Winters, General Harrison said as I concluded, the Joint Chiefs have unanimously approved the expanded deployment based on your team's innovations. Congratulations. As applause filled the room, my gaze found James sitting quietly in the back row. He'd flown in from London that morning, where he'd been leading Westbrook's European division for the past 18 months. The physical distance had been his suggestion, giving us both space to rediscover ourselves independently before attempting to rebuild together. Our Riverside dinner that night 2 years ago had been the first of many honest conversations. No pretense, no performance. Just 2 people finally seeing each other clearly. We talked about everything. His father's toxic influence, my capitulation to expected roles, the mutual dishonesty that had corroded our foundation. I'm not sure we can fix this, I'd admitted that night. Neither am I. He'd replied with disarming honesty. But I'd like to try. Not by going back to who we were, but by discovering who we could be. His acceptance of the London position had surprised everyone but me. I understood his reasoning. He needed to establish his own identity away from both his father's shadow and my authority. Our marriage would either reconstruct itself between equals or end with dignity. For 18 months, we maintained separate lives connected by weekly video calls that gradually evolved from awkward to comfortable to something approaching intimate. We spoke honestly about our work, our growing self-awareness, our hesitant hopes. No performance, no expectations, just authentic discovery. After the Pentagon briefing, we walked the National Mall together, Washington's monuments illuminated against the evening sky. I've been offered the directorship of Westbrook's new ethics. In Defense Technology Division, James said finally, based here in D.C. Returning to headquarters? Under my division? I asked, surprised. He shook his head. Parallel structure, direct report to the CEO. No professional complications. The implication was clear. He was considering a return, not just to the country but potentially to our marriage. Not as my subordinate, in any sense, but as a genuine partner. The man who called me his trophy wife now wants to run an ethics division, I observed with gentle irony. Poetic justice, he acknowledged with a wry smile. Though I'd argue I've earned the perspective, that makes me right for the role. As we reached the Lincoln Memorial steps, James stopped and turned to me. I'm not the same man who dismissed you at that family dinner, he said quietly. And you're not the woman who allowed it to happen. We've both changed, become more fully ourselves. Are you asking if there's still a chance for us? I said directly. I'm asking if you'd like to find out, he replied. Not as your husband or your subordinate, but as your equal, as your partner. Under the watchful gaze of Lincoln's statue, I considered the journey that had brought us here, from performance to authenticity, from hierarchy to partnership. Whatever came next would be built on truth rather than expectation. Yes, I said simply. I would.